everybody drift on in. Good evening, everyone. Yes, how do you like it when it gets dark an hour earlier, right? Yes. Well, there's an advantage to coming in the back way, particularly in the dark. You got a traffic light on the way out, which is good. Trying to turn left off onto West Tennessee Street is a pain any time of the day. But this time of year at night is difficult. Anyway, I know most of you all. I'm Bob Holliday, president of the Historical Society. I've gotten quite a bit of comment about the newsletter I sent out last week. I'm here to tell you that our speaker, Ed Ornstein, told me before he got started tonight that the Miccosukee were going to claim all of Killarn Estates for their ancestral lands. So they're there to get ready to move. This meeting has drawn more interest than anyone I can remember for a while. We've had 106 people register for this, which is unbelievable. We love you guys for your interest and continuing interest in this. A couple of news items. One is that we've got swag for the first time in quite a while. If you came in, you got a chance to get a lapel pin with our logo on it. We have T-shirts for new members that'll be available at our festival starting in the spring, and we'll figure out if you want one. We'll figure out something. So this is what they look like. Our logo on the front, Lake Miccosukee on the back, and all of the people. Yeah, I know they're great. All of the people who are our sponsors and our donors. And there are all sorts of things to say tonight. I'll save some of them for the end. I will say that our speaker is Edward Ornstein, who is the Deputy General Counsel of the Miccosukee Tribe of Florida, one of only 2 federally recognized tribes in the state, along with the Seminoles. And Andrew Jackson chased them down into the Everglades, and now they're back. So I think this is good. So without further ado, I will introduce Edward.
He's Jay. Mahenwe Haboya Jahachef Kados Hasos and Jimusko Ganones Hadogit. Well, you guys know the rest. So, my name is Edward Ornstein. I serve as the Deputy General Counsel and the Embassy Director for the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida. Really excited to be here with y'all and really appreciate the Tallahassee Historical Society and Bob, and also my wife, for being here today and having me out to talk to y'all. Bob was joking about Killarn Estates, but sort of, actually. There is an approved county historical marker that may be going into that region. Do y'all know that road going in Kenhaga?
Yeah.
So that was actually the Miccosukee leader during the American Revolution and the War of 1812. So they're not to joke, but there is actually some solid history out there. We're going to be talking about him a little bit today. We're also going to be talking about the grand sweep of history that brought the Miccosukee from up here down to the Everglades, and also talking a little bit about who the Miccosukee were before getting that name of Miccosukee. Just like who were the Americans before they got the name of Americans, you know? So this is a lot of history to condense. So I'd love to maybe poll y'all, because I've done talks like this before. Gotta say, never done one at Mission San Luis. So who here is familiar with Appalachian history generally? All right. Is anyone familiar with the history of the Appalachian towns that were not part of the mission system? Awesome. All right. I'm gonna be looking at y'all three-ish to see if I'm saying everything right? No. So first of all, I do want to acquaint y'all a little bit to my client. I'm not Miccosukee, by the way. I'm an enrolled member of the Southeastern Muskogee Nation up in Alabama. So I'm just a lawyer here. That's my client. This is the Tribal Council of the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida from left to right. Treasurer Kenny Cypress, Assistant Chairman Lucas Osceola, Chairman Talbert Cypress, Secretary William Osceola, or Popeye, and lawmaker Pete Osceola Jr. So I think we can start by orienting ourselves to a place that you guys have never been before. I like to call it the American South. But really, I want to point out some rivers here, because I'm going to say the names of a lot of rivers in this presentation, because they were sort of the historic highways of the region. And so if you don't know your riparian geography, it might get a little confusing. So that's the St. Johns, that's the Suwannee, the Apalachicola. To the west of that, I think you're seeing the Choctawhatchee. That's probably all we need to pay attention to. Other than that, if you look at the Apalachicola, it turns into a Y when it hits Georgia. The east part of the Y, that's called the Flint River. The western part of the Y ceases to be called the Apalachicola and begins to be called the Chattahoochee upon passing into Georgia's borders. This is just for color, because the people we're talking about, we don't have photos of them in the 1500s. We do have plenty of photos from sort of the early photography period, which is what you guys are looking at now. This is the first decade of the 1900s. And this is a group, from the looks of it, that are hanging out in the Big Cypress. But now let's talk about what Florida was. We're gonna cast back to like the 1500s. In the 1500s, when the Spanish were getting to this future state, they first landed generally in Tampa Bay. Your Narvaez, your De Soto, obviously Ponce de Leon, more active a little bit on the East Coast. But the area that they explored and then claimed for Spain was not the Florida we know today. It was this, give or take. Went up towards the Savannah River in parts. You know, there were Guale missions of the Spanish that were on the Savannah River. It goes west a fair bit farther than it does today, or at least into the areas that we would understand to be Gulf Shores, Alabama. And this region gets shrunk over time. In particular, there's a Treaty of Coleraine in 1796 where sort of the more modern borders get drawn. But when I talk about Florida, what I mean is going to differ depending on the time. But when those people got to Tampa Bay and they went north, the people in Tampa, they were like, there's this really rich area, it's got gold. It's called Appalachia. And so folks went up to the area between a couple rivers, in this case between, it doesn't show the Osceola and Ocklawaha, but you can imagine they're just sort of interior of the Apalachicola and the Suwannee. And that region was called Appalachia. Does anyone know what Appalachia means? This is a point of scholarly debate, but I'll settle it for you guys. So according to an elder, Appalachia just means on the other side. And that's actually the same exact etymology that Swanton advocated for. So that's the one I'm taking. In the modern Miccosukee dialect, the Vilapangi, that is pronounced Apalawet rather than Apalajay, but it just means on the other side. So someone was walking in this direction and they were like, what do you call those people? And they said, Apalajay. So then the Spanish do a thing that is characteristic to their mode of colonization and settlement. And rather than, as the British did, bringing large numbers of settlers, they brought two groups primarily, priests and soldiers. Now were their settlers? Sure. But they were largely concentrated in the two urban areas of Florida at this time, St. Augustine and Pensacola. And the area between, generally speaking, was inhabited almost entirely by indigenous people. As the mission system grew, sure, like, you'd have 10 or 15 families moving in, and, that might be your blacksmith and your cobbler or what have you, but otherwise, this whole region was very much dominated by indigenous people. And then the Spanish, they're really struggling over in that St. Augustine colony because they keep starving. They were not good at logistics in that period of time, so they needed food. And aside from the genuine interest in the conversion of non-Christian peoples to Christianity, when they set up the mission system, they also set up a system of farms, which would supply food to the urban areas of Florida. And in many ways, the Spanish probably were looking at this region as like a breadbasket to support their colony of Florida. And so this area starts getting missionized. We're in, obviously, Mission San Luis. That comes as no shock to y'all. But let's throw some dates on here. Maybe around 1608 is when we can talk about the beginnings of the missioning process. And then around 1638 is when you have the first sort of garrisons of soldiers that were brought in to protect the missions. Now, the people that were getting converted were not one people. This is something that gets a little confusing. If you're looking in the Appalachian mission lists, you're not just seeing Appalachians. You're seeing Tama, Yamasi, Chine, Amacano. I don't think the Chisca really had a mission, but they were in the area, as were groups of Tocobaga. There was at least one group of Tocobaga that was settled in the Appalachia region, who weren't missionized, but according to Han, they converted to Christianity of their own devices. So you have a really ethnically diverse region. Now, what's the language they're speaking here? Broadly, the language is, from our perspective, something we would call Ilapongi. You will never find the word Ilapongi in a scholarly work until the Miccosukee publishes their own. But that's the actual name of the language in the language, right? Now, the dialect of the Miccosukee is generally called Miccosukee. The dialect of other tribal towns, like ones farther to the north, like Hitchiti, would get called Hitchiti. The dialect of the towns a little bit to the east would get called Yamasi. The dialect of the towns to the south, Appalachia. Now, Hudson, Milanich, and they all agree these languages were generally mutually intelligible. So we can talk about these as dialects of Ilapongi, rather than trying to, count the angels on the head of the pin here as we try to recategorize and do all the linguistic divisions. Not that that's a worthless pursuit. People have made their careers on it. But for our purposes, what do the Miccosukee call it? They call it Ilapongi. So we're calling it Ilapongi. Now, as this region began to get converted, you began to have a chain of missions that were running along the Camino Real. And this is a cool map, but not what I'm looking for. Roughly, it's similar to State Road 90. It's not State Road 90 exactly, but it was a route that ran from St. Augustine to Pensacola and had quite a number of these missions located along it. Now, this is from the Calderon Visita from 1674 to 1675, but we're not there yet historically, so imagine there's a few less missions at this point. I just like this map because it's actually clear. But you begin with a group of missions who first converted to Christianity. Now, as you head up to one of the first major revolts of the Appalachian era in 1647, it becomes clear that the story that the friars were telling about the region being, a place that was incredibly welcoming to the missions wasn't the whole story. And I would say we're indebted to Dr. Aubrey Lauersdorf over at FSU for doing some really cool work with some of these same sources. Looking at them, not necessarily from the mission perspective, but looking at them from the perspective of the people who were living at the time. And what comes out when you look at that really early revolt, we're talking like less than 10 years after the soldiers showed up at the missions, right? Is that it wasn't a revolt. At that point in 1647, there was only about 20% of the towns in the region that were missionized. 80% of the Appalachia region, of the towns in the Appalachia region, were not missionized. And now let's talk what we mean by a town. That's really a translation. In Miccosukee, you might say Oglet. In my tribe's language, Muskogee, you might say Atalwa. But what you're really talking about is a tribal town. Like a tribe that is centralized in a town. We can maybe think of the word city-state as a really good parallel coming from the Western corpus. And just like those city-states of the ancient Mediterranean, maybe Athens, Corinth, Delos, they formed together into leagues, into defensive coalitions, like the Delian League, which fought back against Persian incursions. And Gatchett, who was a historian writing in the 1840s or so, he makes a really good point that talking about, chiefdoms and confederacies with those English words is actually really misleading for an audience that's better acquainted with those European systems of government. He picks a word that he thinks is going to work great in English, Symmachie. Nobody knows what Symmachie is. But that is a reference, it's a Greek term that is specifically referring to those organizations of city-states, those war leagues, which would come together in classical antiquity. So, as we talk about Appalachia, to the extent that there's an Appalachia, it's a coalition of towns in a place. And there's a coalition of towns in the place that are part of the mission system, and they're about 20% of the towns. And then there's a coalition of towns in the place that are not part of the mission system. And they're speaking Elepongi, right? Now there's this other group we mentioned, the Chiska. They were long enemies of the Appalachia and of the Chicado, who we would argue also spoke an Elepongi dialect, who were immediately to the west. They were a more nomadic people who spoke a linguistic isolate, and in English, generally we would understand the Spanish term Chisca to be referring to the Yuchi, who were, known in part through their residence, also in Georgia at this time. Now, that word Chisca, just as an aside, it comes from an Elepongi term, ochise, which sometimes gets rendered as like ochisi in the British to refer to Muskogees, and then it gets rendered as Chiska to refer to the Yuchi. This is just the word meaning foreigner in Elepongi. And to this day, the Miccosukee still refer to themselves as the Ilaposhni Chakli, the people who speak our language, and they'll refer to the others in the state who are also native but speak a different language as the Chishaboni, the people who speak a different language. So all that Chiska means is they speak a different language. But there's a group of Chiska or Yuchi who are residing in the area who are not getting along with the Spanish, and they form an alliance with the non-Christianized Appalachia towns. And it was that alliance that actually attacked the Appalachian missions in 1647. Now this sometimes gets written as a revolt. That's not a revolt. And I think Dr. Lauersdorf makes that point really well. It was a different faction of Appalachia who were attacking and trying to topple the political gains made by the faction of Appalachia who aligned with the Spanish. Now, they they win for a moment and then they lose. There's a group of Timucuans who come out from the east with the Spanish and they knock that group out. But then we're left with this intervening period. After that revolt ends, among other things, the Spanish, they levy a repartimiento, like a labor draft, starting to require forced labor from the Appalachian missions. Now, there's also an effort to then bring even more Appalachians into that mission system. This starts to really ruffle some feathers. In the the turn of the 1640s to the 1650s, there's a town here, Osceola, or take your pronunciation, which is right on the Osceola River, which gets its name from the town. And Don Manuel of Osceola was the leader at the time. He spoke a dialect of Timucuan from the farther western Timucuan region, the Timucuans being east of the Appalachians. And he was really complaining to the governor at the time, saying, guys, like, you're running out all the people in my town. You're making conditions really bad. You're expecting this labor. You're bringing in your cattle and not to give to us, but to graze on our lands. He actually makes a really specific complaint too. He says, and they're up in our hamaca, and you're putting all your cattle in our hamaca. And he's referring to a great lake to the north of the Osceola River. There's really one big lake that's generally north of the Osceola River. It's Lake Miccosukee. Not called that yet. But we see, as early as the Manuel of Osceola letter, which is the oldest writing in a Native North American language, we see this trend grow of people that were part of the mission system wanting to leave it. And so there's this other big revolt in the 1670s. I think the Calderon visitation happens right after, right before it. And, aside from all the politics there, it results in further clamping down by the Spanish. And then in this period from 1680 to 1704 or so, you start to have this bleed of people from the missions. People that their contemporaries are describing them as going off into the woods. This is the language Manuel of Osceola uses. This is the language generally used in this period. The Spanish have a term for that too. When you have, a person, or really the origin of the term, is if you have livestock and they leave the fold and they go out into the woods. You call them cimarrones. And so you have this growing trend of cimarrones communities in the Appalachian region, acknowledging, by the way, like we did a couple minutes ago, it was never a fully converted region either. And then in 1688, last specific example from the 1600s, we're gonna get out of there. In 1688, there was a group of Christianized Appalachian leaders who wrote a complaint to the governor, and this was a period when there was a deputy governor of Appalachia, and there was a bad deputy governor, and he was being mean, this guy named Cabrera. And it was really causing a lot of problems. But this letter, really interestingly, the complaint was, you are scaring our heathen neighbors. We're losing our trade connections. Please stop. And I say all this to make the point that, the history of Appalachia is so often told through its missions. That's where we have the most data. It's not a bad thing, but it's something that we have to question sometimes to understand that there were other people outside the missions. And when the mission system collapses, those people are still there. Now, you have famously the South Carolina Governor Moore. He comes in 1704, big bad invasion, collapses the Appalachian mission system more or less. Now, 7 of the missions are fine, or mostly fine, at the end of his invasion. including one called Kapaicha, which we will return to later. And then he takes a few of the towns sort of wholesale out of Appalachia, because he does the Genghis Khan thing, and he's like, join me and I won't kill you. And he takes those folks, some of them up to Carolina and resettles them. Some of them sort of moved in with the Creeks, the coalition. Remember our coalition discussion? The coalition that was sort of up in the Alabama, Georgia region. Now, notably, Han mentions that almost all of the folks that were resettled into that region, by the time Antonio Mateos was out of office, they came back. And often in the intervening period, they formed the pro-Spanish core of that coalition, the Apalachicoli or Lower Creek Coalition, and they then returned to the region, oftentimes alongside Apalachicoli invaders or similar, but more or less, you see this fragmentation of the mission system. And in its place is not nothing, but rather it's these people in the woods, as the contemporary sources are calling it. Now, there's this other phenomenon. Whenever people in this region get attacked, if you look in the De Soto Chronicles, they'll say they went to their big lakes, their Lago Grande, for refuge. Really effective if you're fighting an enemy on horseback to go into a wetland marsh. Notably, that's what the Miccosukee did, several hundred years later, in the march down into the Everglades. And so it is no wonder then that as we view the shift from the Spanish era to the British era, and the British, they send a bunch of folks to do some censuses. This is First Treaty of Paris, 1763. We find Miccosukee. That's the first mention of Miccosukee as a town on a map. And we find Miccosukee on the northern end of the Appalachia region, on the southwestern banks of Lake Miccosukee. Now, there's some other interesting things we find in those early records. One, there was a town of Chiska, or Yuchi, living on the same lake, on the northeastern side, who were closely allied with the Miccosukee. Now, this would later be Yuchi Billy's town in the Seminole War era, but all the same. And then you have a couple other towns around it that are speaking the same language. And then you have the guy who's running Miccosukee at the time. Now, he gets a lot of names. I kind of think he was trying to use some English titles, like a lot of folks in the same period. King Payne, for example, who was ruling out in the Alachua prairies. And he called himself Ken Hadjo or Ken Haga. You guys get where I was going there with the road name at the start? I think he was saying King Haga or King Harjo. The other reason I think that is the other name they called him was Seneta Haga. And if you look at how it's spelled, it looks like Senator Haga. But this was a practice. It's how you got recognition from your European peers at the time, is to use titles that were intelligible in their political system. But then he was also called a different name, a name that probably has a little bit more traditional weight behind it. He was called the Old Capeche Miko. Now, when you see that formula, Old blank Miko, that means you're talking about one of two things. Either there's an old town that's no longer there, and this is the guy who ran it, or there's a new town that's where an old town once was, and this is the guy running it. So is there a Capeche? There is. And in fact, we can see Capeche in the San Damian de Capaicha or Capeche mission, which was out sort of in this map, I think just south of Lake Jackson. It eventually moved a little bit west of the Ochlaquan. And it had 4 satellite missions. It was one of the bigger ones, and it was also one of the ones that remained after the invasion by Moore. Now, a group of them, and Hannah's careful about this, he says a part of the Capeche go west towards Pensacola. Where'd the other part go? And so we have these folks on Lake Miccosukee. We have a town being run by the Capeche Miko. We have a group of Chiska living in the same place, even though they're theoretically ancient enemies. there are not great written records in this period. And so it is our best theory that the Miccosukee descend from the faction of Appalachia who refused to convert, who allied with the Chicka, who made war on the Spanish, who aligned therefore with the Apalachicola or Lower Creeks who were in southern Georgia along the Chattahoochee and Flint rivers. And in so doing, they preserved their access to their traditional homelands in Florida, despite all of the invasions going back and forth throughout those hundreds of years. Now, something called the American Revolution comes around. And we have some good, we're going to really start to get the resources talking about Miccosukee in the English language. And it's Captain Holmes who comes to the Miccosukee and says, please help. And they say something like, you know, we always get these requests from St. Augustine to help, but no one ever helps us. They eventually do agree to help out. But that comment gives you a little bit more context on their relationship with St. Augustine as well. And so the Miccosukee do not only field their own troops, I think this is interesting, Captain Holmes, he goes to Tallahassee, Talofa. And he says, well, they're going to do whatever the Miccosukee are going to do. And then he goes to another town in the same region, the Appalachia Oldfields. And they said, have you talked to Kinhaja? And so all of these towns in this region in this period of time were deferring politically to Miccosukee. Now, I know he was calling himself a king. We aren't really kingdoms at that point. So what we're talking about a coalition. We're talking about a hegemon in that coalition. Again, we're going back to our Greek words. Just a sort of dominant party in an equal alliance of towns. That's who we would understand Miccosukee to be relative to the other towns in the Appalachia region in this British period. And up north, in Creek country, something is happening. They are very rapidly centralizing. And they're centralizing at the strong guidance of US officials. This guy named Galphin for a while, and then following Galphin and his influence was this gentleman named Benjamin Hawkins, whose main contribution to America is the phrase, God willing, the creek don't rise. Just not referring to water. He said it in congressional testimony. That's like the first recorded mention of that. So the creeks are rapidly centralizing. In 1796, at the urging of Hawkins, they basically abolish the independence of the tribal towns, which were defined by having a traditional fire, and a pole, and other sort of markers of their sovereignty. Put them all together. He made people of one fire. And he said, that guy can speak for all of them. The British love that. And this really builds on, because we're skipping a lot of Creek history, this builds on some stuff that was happening in Alabama, Georgia before that. A gentleman named Brems during the Yamasee War and the era that followed. And he was feted in many ways. He was called the Emperor of the Creeks by the British, because again, they wanted someone to speak for them. This guy that came later, MacGillivray, who succeeded Brem's successor, Malachi. MacGillivray was given a scepter and a crown and a robe by the British. They were really stepping it up, because they wanted into that land and they needed like one guy to talk to get them in. And they were really hoping those guys up there would also be able to get them into Florida. Didn't quite work out that way. So there's sort of two things worth mentioning here. MacGillivray, right before that centralization, he was acting as a speaker of an alliance, a coalition of towns, and Miccosukee were maybe part of that. Copaicha is mentioned on the Treaty of Pensacola in 1783. But that treaty never mentions Creek. MacGillivray negotiates that treaty on behalf of each individual town. And he distinguishes between the towns that he considers part of that nation to the north, and those towns which he is also speaking on behalf of. It's like the preamble to the treaty. It's like a whole page long, just a listing of towns and how he related to each of those towns. The Capache, the Miccosukee, were part of and also speaking on behalf of these groups. So they were not part of the nation as he understood it. And this came to a head in 1796. I mentioned that Treaty of Coleraine and the renegotiation of these Florida boundaries. Well, the Americans, they'd gone to the Creeks, and they're like, hey, we want all of this. We want all of this to be Georgia. And we're going to shift that line down, and it's just going to clear a lot of stuff up. And Spain's much weaker now, so they're going to say yes. Creeks, can you approve it? Great, Treaty of Coleraine. But the Creeks caution the Americans. They say, but we can't speak on behalf of the people south of that line. And so they send surveyors down anyways. The Americans, they get a crew together, they go down to the Apalachicola River, they start sailing down, it's nighttime, they turn their flashlights off. See if you guys are still with me. And they go to sleep. And they wake up, and all of their sails are slashed, and their boats are floating back up the river. And they're like, who did that? And we get actually a lot of granularity on what happened. Kinhajo, who we were just talking about, Kinhega, if you prefer the name on the road sign. Kinhega went down to the Fort San Marcos, the Spanish fortress in the area, and he's like, hey, so are you giving away my land? And the Spanish commandant of the fort was like, don't worry about it. It's just a European deal between European powers. It won't affect your land at all. So Kinhega was like, he must be lying. So then the sails get slashed, and shortly thereafter, the Americans seek to compel the Spanish, go get them. They just slashed our sails. They're stopping the deal that you and I made. And so the Spanish try to go get them. And so the Miccosukee-Spanish War lasts from 1796 to 1802. In that intervening period of time, the Miccosukee burned. My PhD historian partner that I work on with this says I can't say most, but I think the answer is many of the plantations in East Florida, substantively collapsing the economic base of Spanish Florida. Other cool things they did during that war. The longest and successful siege in the European sense of castle. They sieged Fort San Marcos and they took it. Now, they might have sent a gunship, Spain sent a gunship up, and so they evacuated the fort. But they took the fort after a month-long protracted siege. And similarly, they made a friend. This friend was called William Augustus Bowles. And I feel like you guys have done some programming on Bowles before, but he was a pirate, sometimes lovingly called an adventurer. He was a pirate. And he formed, alongside with a mixed blood native merchant that was living on the forts of the Chattahoochee, Flint, Apalachicola, this gentleman named Perryman, and with Kinhajo of the Miccosukee, a three-man directorate general. And those three men, presided over the capture of like 7 Spanish vessels, piracy, and really successfully prosecuted this war against the Spanish. The Spanish were forced to concede in 1802. Among the articles of the treaty, the 5th article, I believe, is Kinhajo had to kick out all the white people that were working with them, those pirates. They agreed, they weren't worried about that. And then the Miccosukee went up and, settled things with their northern neighbors in 1803. But that kind of defined, while, they ended up redrawing the border, that defined a really clear political separation between the lands south of that border and the lands north of that border. And the Miccosukee claimed the lands north of that border. Those were Ilopangi lands. Those were the lands of the Iloposhnichakli going back thousands of years. Those areas in the Apalachicola province, and Yamasi and Tama, those were their relatives. So they felt the loss of their lands being cut in half by this sort of artificial line. But they kept their part. And then some stuff happens up north again. Creeks have a civil war, sort of a proxy front of the War of 1812. Faction alliance with the US, faction alliance with the British. The traditionalist faction with the British, the sort of assimilationists with the US. I won't go into that very much. But the traditionalists align with the British lose. And so they flee south. It's a huge refugee migration. I forget who I'm quoting. I think Swanton says this, but some other people say it too. The population before the War of 1812 in North Florida was a third of what it would be in 1816. So the population of the region explodes with refugees from Creek Country. Now, the dominant language in Creek Country is Miccosukee, but there were also, the largest minority of the Creeks were these Ilopangi speakers, the Hitchites, the Akanis, the Apalachicola, the Euphalathli folks. And so this region explodes. Now what's happening here is it's Spanish. The Spanish, they came back at the end of the American Revolution. They reclaimed it from the British. They were just swapping it for, the Bahamas or something. Don't quote me on that. But the British kind of hung out. And so while this was a Spanish colony, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Nichols was in the middle of the Spanish colony on the Apalachicola River, and he was building fortresses with the Miccosukee along the Apalachicola River. Those forts, by the way, I don't think it's often well known, the Miccosukee built them. It was Kanahajo who was actually contracted, he was sort of a captain of the British at the time as well, to conduct the construction of those fortresses in large part. And what ends up happening is the Miccosukee and their friend Lieutenant Colonel Edward Nichols, so they'd switched to the Lieutenant Colonel from the pirate of a decade before. He wants to step up. And the Lieutenant Colonel was very interested in building up a resistance to the American colony. That was sort of the history that had been happening there in this American Revolution, this War of 1812. And so one of the things that the Miccosukee and Nichols are particularly concerned with is if they can house some of the escaped or liberated black slaves who were living up in Georgia and Alabama. Now they do it different down here in Florida. They give them guns, put them in colonial marine uniforms, and they put them in the forts. And also the Miccosukee house a large number of folks in a town that was north of Miccosukee, roughly where the modern community of Miccosukee is today. And that community was, I don't know if we can say they were free or enslaved, honestly. What was happening there is there was sort of this vassal relationship where folks were settled in a separate community, and that community had sort of like this sharecropping expectation. There was a certain amount of the produce that was produced in that community that the Miccosukees were going to expect. But there was no direct overseeing in the way that slavery was happening in Alabama and Georgia. So folks were escaping and going there for refuge. Jackson, who we skipped over in the story so far, but he was in the War of 1812, he was a general. He was watching this, slave owner, but notably also sort of a real estate speculator. And he was like, what would be a great idea is if we chased those military-aged men across the southern border and took all the land for ourselves. And so this is the first Seminole War. You have a buildup of troops that first happens in the Chattahoochee, north of what is today the Florida border. These troops are a mix of those Creeks we were talking about and American regulars. It's about 1,800 Creeks, about 1,000 American regulars. The Creeks were, I have to mention this, under the command of Brigadier General William McIntosh, or Tuskegee Hudkey, which is my 5th grade grandfather. But the Creeks invade with Jackson at the helm, and they march through much of North Florida. And they march through, in particular, the region around Lake Miccosukee. And they don't actually take a casualty count. They do record that they burnt every house. So it was a total, cleansing, ethnic cleansing, we might say, of the region. And at the end of the war, there was an effort to negotiate a treaty, the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, which would push people into a Central Florida Seminole reservation. We haven't really addressed the word Seminole. It comes probably from that Spanish word Cimarrones, but then to the Creek language in Muskogee, and they probably used it to call those like refugee flows south out of their community. They probably called those Seminole. And so you just generally start calling this whole region Seminoles. By the 1800s, if you're living in North Florida and you're not white, you're Seminole, right? So they tried to create a Seminole reservation in Central Florida. And they're like, everybody go down there. But Miccosukie's leader, Kinhajo, first of all, he does die in 1819. He is succeeded, as far as we can tell, by not one person, but sort of a fracturing of that Miccosukee world. And there's like a Miccosukee, or rather a Chiska, a Yuchi, from that town on the northeast banks that does hangback. It's this guy named Vigoshi Amatla or John Hicks. And you know, there's this whole saga where Governor Duval deposes Nematla, who was an Ilopangi-speaking leader from the Foul Pounds, just over the border in Georgia, who had come and taken refuge with the Miccosukee. And then he installs this gentleman, John Hicks, or the Vigoshi Amatla, to run the Seminole Coalition. And I think it's like Washington Carver or someone. Someone writes a really interesting story in that period called The Conspiracy of Nematla, but I won't try to remember the author. And then you have another group, this guy named Tiger Tail, who was pretty young at the time, but he gets a job as a huntsman for Governor Duval. And so he's hanging out with the Duvals. The Gambles remember him hanging out with them, the Browns remember him hanging out with them. He seems to have made a circuit around a lot of the plantations, bringing them food, and whenever he would come, those folks recall him bringing dozens of his compatriots. Such that future Governor Call, but at the time General Call, sees him on the road in like 1835 or whatever, maybe 1836, and he's like, which way are you going? Because something just happened. There was another group of Miccosukes under the leadership of this gentleman, Abiake, who had been with the Tapananalka tribal town, also one of these sort of satellite towns around Miccosukee. And he had headed south really early, down to the Miami River by 1821, was salvaging shipwrecks, came back up, joined with the Alachua folks in Central Florida, joined also with this refugee dude who was like a kid when he came over from the War of 1812 named Billy Powell, who was being called the Osceola, or Osceola. And they hatched a plan with this other guy, Miccosukee, also from the Alachua Colony. And they attacked this group of US soldiers that was starting to put into effect the recently passed Indian Removal Act. And a lot of people were taking money and they were leaving. Because we gotta remember, 2/3 of the people in Florida weren't from Florida. They'd come in the last 10 years. So a lot of them they were taking these bribes, they were taking these payouts, they were hopping on the boat and they were heading out. So Abiake and Osceola and Miccosukee and folks, they decided to hatch a plan. And they ambush Colonel Dade, and they kill him, about 100 of his men. 3 of them survive, die of their wounds, but live long enough to tell the tale. That's where we get Miami-Dade County from, Dade City, etc. And so we have this new war that's about to start. And General Call, he sees Tiger Tail. And Tiger Tail's riding his horse in the opposite direction. He's like, are you going to war? He's like, yeah, see you there. And actually, Call in his journals recalls that he did see Tiger Tail on the battlefield at that point, on the opposite side of the battlefield. They didn't actually like fight with each other at any point, but they saw each other on the battlefield. That's all to say, after the First Seminole War, this cataclysmic invasion of traditional Miccosukee lands, Miccosukee sort of fragments. Now, what brings Miccosukee back together again is the wars. Because the Second Seminole War is the longest, the bloodiest, the costliest of the US Indian Wars. It is the war of all US wars with the highest rate of junior officer resignation. People who were fighting the war for the US knew they were fighting on the wrong side. Because this was a brutal war of ethnic cleansing. It was, let's round everybody up, let's put them on the boats, let's send them to Oklahoma. At the time, Arkansas Territory, Indian Territory. But this is like incredibly devastating to those communities. This is sort of a concentration camp. I don't use that word lightly. I use it because Hitler used it. In 1941 in Nuremberg, he said, let the Volga River be our Mississippi, and let us send the inferior races, in his case, east of it. So as he's creating this concentration camp system, he is explicitly thinking back to the American Indian removal period, this being the bloodiest front of that Indian removal period. Now, Tigertail, I mentioned him, he was really cool. Him and Abiaki would get like intentionally captured a couple times at the point of removal, and then jailbreak hundreds at a time. They were really upset about that. So they actually moved the concentration camp from the Tampa Bay area, roughly where today the Tampa Bay Lightning Arena is. They moved the bodies. And they moved the concentration camp to Egmont Key out in Tampa Bay. And from there, it was maybe a little bit more effective. It's hard to jailbreak an island. And so by the 1838 or so, we're talking like a couple years of the war. The population had been massively, massively reduced. And I could have skipped a few slides there. So this was that Central Florida reservation. By the end of the Second Seminole War, most folks were getting pushed all the way to the tip of the state. And you had a group under Abiaki at this point. He's calling the shots. He's like top warrior dog. Everybody else is giving in or getting captured. And he moves his people deep into the Big Cypress and the River of Grass. Just like his ancestors had done. When the people on the cavalry come, you go to the marsh. It's just smart. Something he'd experienced doing. And he makes that juncture, because at this point they're down to, a few hundred folks. 10,000 plus had probably been removed out of Tampa Bay at this point. And he meets up with some folks, I can't remember if it was on Tavernier or Plantation Key, but there's this gentleman named Chakika. And Chakika is working with this guy named Escadarque, and they're getting called Spanish Indians. What's a Spanish Indian? This is a point of debate. A recent book came out about it. I'm not sure that I can necessarily recommend it. It's an amateur historian with the sort of associated concerns. But what we can probably say about Spanish Indians is they're Indians connected to the Spanish Empire. That's sort of obvious. What was probably happening though is there was a population of people who had been removed from the mission system, in large part, who were now in Cuba, and who were sort of popping back and forth between the Keys and Cuba, maybe acting as like itinerant fishermen. We actually kind of know this because someone found the baptismal records of Chakika, and he was a Tamantli Appalachian, from way up north. But they ran into him in the Keys, and they made a juncture with him. They were like, all right, we're both gonna fight the Americans together. And then right after that, some folks signed a truce, not a treaty, agreed to a truce. And they did not include those Keys in the truce. Instead, the truce lines were Shark River, which is roughly that big Everglades line, south and west, and then the Peace River, which is sort of the Caloosahatchee River neighborhood, south. So all of Southwest Florida was being set aside as Indian territory. This was first agreed upon, I can't remember if it was General McComb or General Worth who first agreed it. But as my statement belies, it was then broken and re-agreed to. It was broken because Chakika was upset, and so he did a raid on Indian Key. And that was like the US Southern Command at the point. And he sort of torched it. And so these folks followed him back into the Everglades, hung him, and I think it's like 12 other folks who were leaders roots of that band on an island that the Miccosukee still remember as the island of the hanging people. They don't set foot there. But the band of those Spanish Indians was adopted into the community. And so as we're sort of talking about the origins of Miccosukee, you got your Appalachee / the, Chicano and Western Timucua who sort of blended into the Appalachee like they did in Osceola and the Chicano missions. Then you also have this Spanish Indian component that joins into the tribe a little bit later. Now, truces were agreed to, either by Macomb or Worth, I can't remember. And then Florida's like, I don't like that. So right when it was re-agreed to in 1842, ending the Second Seminole War, Florida then passes, I think in 1843, the Florida Armed Occupation Act, saying if you can stake out 5 acres, you can kill all the Indians on it for 5 years. At the end of those 5 years, you'll get 160 acres in a land grant. This really opens the settlement of Florida. There were people up in North Florida at this point, but this is what opens the peninsula, really, to settlement. And that was no fun. And so right after that, President Polk releases an executive order memorializing the terms of the Worth Agreement in an executive order and confirming the terms of that agreement. That kind of holds for about 10 years. But this is a period of 10 years of low-grade settler violence as created by the Florida Armed Occupation Act. And then in 1855, the war ends up starting again. Now there was this gentleman, y'all have never heard of him, Jefferson Davis. And he was the Secretary of War. We have that office again now. And the Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis, well, his job is only good for one thing. It's war. So he wanted to get back into it. So he had these surveyors. He was like, guys, can you resurvey the lines of the truce over and over and over? And can you maybe scooch it in a little bit each time you do? And so the surveyors were coming through a tribal leader, Billy Bolex, from the Oconee area. He was coming through his banana field, chopping down banana trees, as the story goes, making a new survey line. And as the story goes, he never left the banana field. So begins the Third Seminole War. Now, the Third Seminole War is different. Only a couple hundred folks left. And they're already deep in the marshlands. There's no protracted, running guerrilla fight from North Florida. No, they're in a natural fortress. And so Colonel Gustavus Loomis is commanding, I think at the time it was mounted infantry for the most part that were fielded in the Third Seminole War. About 8,000 regulars that were fielded in the Third Seminole War. Again, against a couple hundred Miccosukees and Seminoles collectively, and they couldn't find the Indians. The Everglades famously, sometimes, soldiers would come with little boats, and there'd be no water. Sometimes they'd come without boats, it'd be full of water. It's a very seasonally diverse ecosystem with changing water levels year to year that are not consistent year to year either. La Nina, El Nino, those things sort of throw off your water levels. So folks were doing real good hiding in the Everglades. And there were these tree islands that sort of dotted the landscape, and you could retreat to a tree island. And then you could see the forces coming, and be like, all right, you can leave your fire going, just go to the next tree island. And so there's these letters at the end of the Third Seminole War where Colonel Gustavus Loomis is writing to Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. And he's like, please, 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 can I declare victory and leave? It is my best estimate that of the 2 or 3 bands remaining, they probably each have 16 or 17 warriors. And I can't find them. And so Jefferson Davis says, yes, they declare victory and leave. Now, this is because 1858, there's some history happening towards the end of 1858. We're going into a year we know as 1859. From 1859, we go into 1860. And Jefferson Davis, he goes to a different country at that point. And so The American troops, who had been building up really since the War of 1812, they vanished. Florida is not a substantive front of the US Civil War. There's like a Union naval blockade, you got Confederates trying to run the blockade to get food and arms in. It's like one or two land battles that are up in North Florida, but it's not anything like the Seminole Wars were. The Seminole Wars swept the whole state and brought a lot of new technology, by the way, before I leave the Seminole Wars behind. I'm an FSU alum. I like FSU. The mascot holds a spear. Osceola did not use a spear in combat. In fact, in 1836, when Samuel Colt sent his first shipment of revolvers, generally revolving rifles in this context, he sent 2 boxes. One went to Texas, where there was a war going on, and one went to Florida, and Osceola captured it. Now, I don't think he had a lot of cartridges to use those revolvers for any long period of time, so I think it's safe to say that he was, for the most part, as best as we can tell, often using Spanish or British rifling, which was superior to the equivalent American technology. But I think it's worth noting, Osceola outarmed the American troops at the time. There was no spear. But anyways, now you got a couple hundred Miccosukee and Seminole collectively, and they're living deep in the Everglades. This is sort of what it looks like. This is 1910. And you can see the water. At this point in the year, it just happens that it's about to her ankles. This is a guy pulling a canoe. It's just deep enough to pull a canoe, but not paddle a canoe. Sort of illustrates the ecosystem a little bit. These are all, I think, for the most part, 1910 images. I actually think that's going to be Moosa Island, an early tourist camp that was built out on the Miami River. See that picture? The elder on Counsel, Pete Osceola Jr., he was born in that camp. So there's a lot of like historical continuity we can see. Now he's on the older side. But he might have been one of those kids. No, he would be mad at me. Not 1910. So, this is what happens to the Everglades next. In the 1880s, the railroads start coming through. There's this guy, Diston, he starts doing some private drainage. And then there's a Governor Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. And you know everything's about to go south when you hear Napoleon Bonaparte. And he decides, you know, it would be great if we took the marsh and we just drained it. So he builds like 400 miles of levees, dikes, berms, and canals. And then the Okeechobee dike catastrophically fails. Thousands of people die, mainly Miccosukee Seminoles and black farm workers living around Okeechobee and working on those farms. And so they call in the cavalry again. And they bring in the Army Corps of Engineers in the 1940s. The Central and Southern Florida Project is inaugurated then by Congress. And until 1964, I think, when they finish the CSFP, they build 2,175 miles of canals and 2,130 miles of levees, dikes, and berms. The Everglades, as the Miccosukee and Seminole knew it, as the widest river in the world, from one side of the state to the other, flowing very gradually south, that was gone, replaced with boxes. And around this same period, the federal government, they're coming out of World War II and they're broke. So they do this thing where they terminate the recognition of tribes, so they don't have to pay their treaty obligations anymore. There's a concurrent resolution of the House and Senate, I can't remember if it's 106 or 108, that passes through the chambers in 1954, seeking to terminate the existence of the Seminoles of Florida, inclusive of the Miccosukee at that point in time, because remember, Seminoles coalition. And the body of those folks, they make some concessions to the American government. They move reservations, largely urban reservations in places like Broward County. And those folks become known again in 1957, formally as the Seminole Tribe of Florida. But then you got these Miccosukes. If you didn't get anything from my story so far, they're fiercely independent, and they don't like to compromise their rights to their lands. We learned that from Kanhaja. So the Miccosukes, they go and they kill 4 deer. And on the backs of those deer, they write 4 buckskin declarations. They take one to Eisenhower. He doesn't want to meet. You can find it in his Presidential Library and Museum in Abilene, Kansas. They take one to Queen Elizabeth. You know, we did a records request. There's a lot of diplomatic correspondence back and forth. They're like, the Miccosukee, they won't leave until someone takes their declaration. They're just like standing outside Buckingham Palace. So they get received. A red receipt is sent by Queen Elizabeth because she's eminently polite. And they send another one. You know, you can tell what they're doing now. They're going to the countries with which they had historic relationships. So they send one to Spain. And in fact, and it's not in this PowerPoint, but there's some great pictures of the King and Queen of Spain receiving Miccosukee leadership, but they didn't really want to do anything. Notably, in this period of time, this gentleman named Francisco Franco was running Spain a little bit more than the royals were. And so they got 1 deer left. And so they write a buckskin declaration and they send it to the former crown colony of New Spain, with whom they had maintained a trade relationship. Folks used to go down in ocean-going canoes to and from the crown colony of New Spain, aka Cuba. And this was, if we remember, the late 1950s. And so, that might be roughly my time. I'm working on it. And so, this guy with this long beard named Fidel Castro, he gets this letter written on deer hide from the Miccosukee, who, by the way, claim all the land where all the nuclear missile silos are that are pointed at his islands. And he's like, yeah, come on down. So there's a great picture of Che Guevara sitting very politely on the tarmac, welcoming the Miccosukee who are getting off the plane. And the Miccosukee spend a week with Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. They drink a lot of good Cuban rum, they smoke some good Cuban cigars. And at the end of that week, the foreign minister of Cuba recognizes the Miccosukee as a sovereign nation with sovereign control over their territories in a government-to-government relationship with Cuba. And so the Miccosukee happily returned to Miami, which loves Cuba. That joke would really land in South Florida, but trust me, there's a lot of tension there, guys. And so, you know, the Miami Herald runs a bunch of stories, and the Miccosukee get a call from the White House. It's like, we gotta work this out. And so Eisenhower's out, Kennedy's in. In 1962, finally, Kennedy reaches an agreement with the Miccosukee, recognizes them as a sovereign nation, a domestic dependent nation, as America does with tribes, and one with a distinct government-to-government relationship with the United States from the relationship maintained by the Seminole Tribe of Florida. Great. So Kennedy's like, and we have a reservation for you. And so the Miccosukee, for 20 years, sue for all of Southwest Florida. Because, you know, what else are you going to use your sovereignty for? And at the end of those 20 years, in 1982, the Florida Indian Land Claims Settlement Act was signed, quadrupling the lands of the Miccosukee to include all of the lands they were currently living in. And also they refused to assign away any Aboriginal rights of individuals to use and occupy any other lands that they were still living in Florida. That was a great settlement. And so today, rather than just the little reservation they're trying to throw the Miccosukee, and I think there's heck back here that makes it make some noise if I get too close. So I'm gonna stand a little bit back. There's also this little strip there, the Miccosukee Reserved Area. There's all this land in between, which is collaboratively managed by the tribe and the state of Florida, these settlement lease lands. And then there's that federal reservation. Collectively, that's all about 300,000 acres. And then you have the Big Cypress National Preserve to the west. There's a separate fight in 1974. Someone tries to build the world's largest airport in the middle of the Big Cypress Swamp, where the Miccosukee are living, and there's Miccosukee villages right out front of where they're building the airport. And so the Miccosukee, they make contact with this lady, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. She has this organization, Friends of the Everglades. Marjorie actually, sort of an old friend of the Miccosukee. She was shown the Everglades in dugout canoes by the Miccosukee, and she may or may not have stolen a translation of a word, Pahaoki, which means river of grass, and named her book after it. But anyways, they advocate for the conservation of this region, and they join together with the hunters, the fishermen, even the oil drillers, who all have interests in the Big Cypress, but who don't want to see this giant airport built with the adjoining largest suburb in the world, Golden Gate. So those get killed. And in 1974, there's like this really early environmental impact statement that says, any further development of this site will be environmentally catastrophic. I will not comment about any activities currently ongoing at the jetport site in Big Cypress, other than to say we are suing people who tried to build more things there. Not because of the specific things they're building, but because it's traditional Miccosukee land. It's fragile environmentally. It's the home of endangered species. And so it's something that in the Miccosukee Constitution, the Miccosukee are obliged to defend. And this kind of catches us up with a lot of the modern history of the Miccosukee. I threw in a picture of the Miccosukee Indian School graduation a few years ago because it's a modern and vibrant community. And we get back to our council members. And if anybody wants to stick around, because I heard Bob's alarm, you guys can ask me questions.
So is there any truth to the rumor that we're about to have the fourth Seminole War?
There's an elder who wears a hat, and it's got the Miccosukee flag on it. It's got 4 ribbons, black, red, yellow, and white. And he says, look at my flag. Look at the flag on my hat. Do you see how the white is on top? That means we are at peace. If I flip the band on my hat over, that's how you know we're at war.
Questions, anyone? Questions for Edward? Surely, come on.
King Higa, did he go by the pyramid name as well?
We generally don't think so. There has been an amateur historian who suggested that was the case. We do not find the evidence to back that up. So, no. Although, maybe.
Questions?
I hear a war room.
Do the Seminoles and Miccosukees live in separate areas?
Very much so. And in fact, I was doodling one day when I was waiting to start my job in Miccosukee. And I doodled this map. And the yellow are the Seminole reservations, the red are the Miccosukee reservations. So you can see a little Seminole one there. There's a Seminole one there that does connect to a Miccosukee reservation. And then they're also up there, northwest of Okeechobee. There's one in the Immokalee, which is barely visible up there, yellow. And then there's one up in Tampa now. So totally different reservations, totally different governments. South Florida-ish.
The site of modern Miccosukee, you said that was the location of a vassalage and sort of the breadbasket of the local area?
Breadbasket, the local area, I think I was saying generally the Appalachia region. That area where the modern Miccosukee town is today, that was a free black community, broadly speaking, but who were sort of subject to the Miccosukee. I'm describing it in like fiefdom language, but everyone has different approaches to how they talk about that. some people will say, you know, those folks were totally free. That there was a resource relationship that constrained that to some degree, but unfortunately, as best as we can understand the sources, the people who were living there were broadly speaking captured and re-enslaved by Jackson's forces. So there's sort of a separate production of a similar community in the region that follows in the post-bellum period.
And the location on the northeast side of Lake Miccosukee,
Mhm.
from my research, it was cited as a second foul town, or
So the best as I would understand where the foul towns, the Tutolosi Talofa folks were at was like a little bit sort of like east, almost due east. There was one north of them. There was one north of Neamatha's town. And the town that was north of Neamatha's town was Uchibili's town, in the Seminole War era. And that was the, you know, Uchibili being a Uchi, you know, that was that Uchi or Chiswick town.
Was it true that pirate William Gustavo was married into the Miccosukee tribe?
I actually have no clue. Maybe not. I'll leave that to people who are experts on bulls. I know he was locked up in Manila for a little bit. That's a fun story. Is that a hand?
When Abiaka was in this area,
Mhm.
where was his land, like his land claim?
Tapananalka, I think from my reading of the Swanton charts, was probably just east of Lake Miccosukee, probably in Jefferson County. But the actual answer is we have a number that's like, you know, 30 miles east of Tallahassee or something. But I would refer you to a book written by John Swanton, Early History of the Creek Indians and Their Neighbors, emphasis on and their neighbors. And he actually has some really solid charts at the back of the book that sort of plot all the towns. But again, he plots the towns with like mileage from places he was familiar with. And there's not actually a map, so I'm kind of guessing here, to be honest. All right, start with you, and then I'll see you back there right after.
Could you tell us a little bit about your embassy and how it's staffed and what your objectives are?
Sure. So I'm the embassy director. We have a group called the Embassy Fellowship. They're generally college-aged students, and they are in a rotating sort of internship up into the Miccosukee Embassy and back. And so it's usually a group of about 2 to 4 of us, depending on the point in time. We got a new group cycling in for the spring term. And we work closely with our partners in the region.
Was Osceola Seminole or Miccosukee?
It's a great question. Osceola was from the town of Talisi, which was north of Florida. I don't even know if it's going to be on this map, but it was kind of that way. And it was up in the Creek country. He was about 10 years old when his hometown was burned down. And his uncle, Peter McQueen, Tamuchisajo, was a medicine man and a leader of the rebellion, the Red Stick Revolt, whatever you want to call it. And he goes south with the young Osceola and takes up refuge in, you know, this broader Miccosukee Seminole territory. So as a refugee from the Creek Nation, we would generally call him a Seminole, not a Miccosukee. However, if we talk about our tribal leadership today, you know, again, there are only like a few hundred folks left in the Everglades at the end of it all. So, last names, Cypress, Osceola, Cypress, Osceola, Osceola. So, there are Osceola descendants in both tribes. Yeah. But I would probably say he was a Seminole at the time.
Well, let's give a big and so forth. And since you guys are giving us the money, we thought we'd give you the book.
Well, thank you very much.
This is a copy of Alexander Key's wonderful novel, The Wrath and the Wind, set in Apalachicola during the 1840s.
Awesome.
And we reprinted it several years ago, and we'd like for you to have a copy of it. Tell us
Excellent.
what you think about it.
Thank you very much. Add up to the embassy.
Add it to the embassy library. Couple of announcements before we adjourn for the evening. First of all, thank you